The Double Game. It was October 21st, 2018, a cold, rainy night in the sleepy town of Greenfield, Indiana. The town was small, where everyone knew each other by name, and rumors spread like wildfire. But that night, no one could have imagined that one of the darkest events in local history was about to happen. Brian Johnson, a successful real estate businessman, was at the height of his career. Owner of a beautiful house on the outskirts of the city and married to Jessica, a woman everyone admired for her beauty and friendliness, he seemed to have the perfect life. His best friend, Chris Wallace, was also successful in the business world. Together with their wives, Jessica and Maria, they formed the perfect quartet. Everyone in the city knew them as an example of friendship and partnership. But behind the smiles at social gatherings and the perfect photos on social media, there was a secret that only two of them knew. Brian and Maria, Chris's wife, had been involved in a steamy affair for months. Their relationship had started innocently enough. An exchange of glances at a party, deeper conversations during the couple's dates, but soon evolved into something more dangerous. They saw each other in secret, always finding discreet ways to keep the affair out of Jessica and Chris's prying eyes. Guilt was a weight they both carried, but the desire and adrenaline of experiencing something forbidden kept them going. Brian was a man who liked to control every aspect of his life, and his relationship with Maria was no different. He believed that as long as he was careful, no one would ever find out. Maria, on the other hand, was impulsive. She lived intensely in the moment, without thinking about the consequences. The affair was the perfect escape from her marriage to Chris, which was already frayed and cold. As the case continued, tension grew. Messages exchanged in secret meetings, and furtive glances during dinners between friends began to become increasingly risky. They both knew they were playing a dangerous game, but neither wanted to stop. The idea of being discovered, instead of pushing them away, attracted them even more. It was like a drug, something they couldn't give up. So, on that fateful weekend, the four friends decided to get away from their routine and rent a country house on the outskirts of Greenfield. Brian and Maria saw this as a perfect opportunity for what would be their biggest coup. The plan seemed simple in theory. They would make their partners drink until they were unconscious, then escape to a nearby motel. In their minds, no one would realize what had happened until it was too late. On the evening of October 21st, the atmosphere was relaxed. Bottles of wine were opened without hesitation, and laughter filled the country house's living room. Jessica and Chris, innocent of the plan unfolding around them, were relaxed, enjoying each other's company. Meanwhile, Brian and Maria exchanged quick glances, silently conspiring. They made sure Jessica and Chris drank more with each round. A dangerous game of manipulation was underway, but neither Jessica nor Chris had any idea. The tension increased with each passing minute. Brian felt sweat running down the back of his neck, while Maria looked at the clock nervously. They were about to execute the plan. Jessica was already visibly altered by the alcohol, and Chris, although still maintaining a firm stance, was beginning to feel the effects. For Brian and Maria, everything was going according to plan. That weekend would be the turning point. They could run away together, leave behind the lives they had built with their partners, and start over. But destiny had other plans. The game they were playing was about to get out of control, and no one in that room knew that that night would change their lives forever. The betrayal they both tried so carefully to hide was about to be revealed in a brutal way. The clock struck 10:30 p.m. when the plan began to fall apart. Chris, in a moment of curiosity mixed with suspicion, took Brian's cell phone, which was on the table. He didn't expect to find anything unusual, but the device's continuous vibration caught his attention. The screen was on, and the name that appeared on the notification made Chris' heart stop for a moment: Maria. Without thinking twice, he unlocked the device. The content of the message made him pale. Maria's message to Brian was clear, full of intimacy and details that only someone very close to her would share. At that moment, Chris's world came crashing down. Anger mixed with disbelief took over him. He was betrayed, not only by his wife, but by the man he considered a brother. Chris, with his cell phone in hand and his face filled with fury, stood up abruptly. Jessica, scared, didn't know what was happening, but the sudden silence in the room was palpable. The game was over, and Chris was about to confront the truth, unaware that it would lead to his tragic end. What followed was the beginning of a nightmare that no one in that room thought possible. The night of October 21st, 2018, which had started as a simple meeting between friends, was about to turn into a tragedy that no one could have predicted. The atmosphere in the country house, which had previously been relaxed, was now filled with suffocating tension. Chris, with Brian's cell phone in hand, looked at what he had just discovered as if the ground were crumbling beneath his feet. His wife, Maria, the woman he had shared a life with, was cheating on him with his best friend. And the proof was right there, before his eyes. Maria, realizing that Chris had discovered the secret, froze. The blood seemed to leave her face as she tried to find something to say, but there was no justification that could fix it. Jessica, sitting next to Chris, was still confused. The alcohol in her system made her slow to process what was happening, but the look of horror on Chris's face made her realize that something terrible had been revealed. The silence that fell over the room was unsettling. Brian, upon noticing the cell phone in the wrong hands, immediately knew they were in trouble. He saw the anger building in Chris's eyes and felt a fear he had never experienced before. Everything was out of control. "Can you explain to me what this is?" Chris finally spoke, his voice low but filled with suppressed anger. He held the phone like a weapon, the screen still lit up with messages exchanged between Brian and Maria. The tone of his voice was icy, almost as if he was trying to remain calm, but the hatred was evident. He knew that a simple verbal confrontation would not be enough for the betrayal that had just been revealed. Brian tried to speak, tried to justify himself, but the words wouldn't come out. He knew that anything he said would only make the situation worse. Maria, on the other hand, could barely look at her husband. The weight of betrayal was clear on his face, but there was also something else there. A touch of fear, perhaps even regret. She never imagined things would get to this point. The tension exploded in a second. Chris took a step towards Brian, his fists clenched, ready to go on the physical assault. Jessica screamed, asking Chris to calm down, but it was too late. Brian, feeling cornered, reacted impulsively. He took a step back, his frantic eyes searching for a way out, and, in a desperate movement, grabbed a knife that was on the kitchen table. What happened next unfolded in a matter of seconds, but to those present, it seemed as if time had slowed down. Chris stepped forward, his intention clear. He wanted answers, and he wanted justice for what had been done to him. But Brian, overcome by fear and adrenaline, couldn't think straight. In an impulsive and irrational act, he raised the knife, and before he could process what he was doing, he struck the first blow. The blade sank into Chris' abdomen, and the scream of pain echoed through the house. Jessica let out a scream of horror, retreating to the corner of the room, her hands shaking as tears ran down her face. Maria stood frozen, her eyes wide, unable to believe what she was seeing. The room, once filled with laughter and friendly chatter, was now plunged into chaos. But Brian didn't stop. The adrenaline took over him completely. Anger, fear, and panic mixed together, transforming him into something monstrous. He delivered blow after blow, each stab more brutal than the last. Blood sprayed with every movement, and before long, Chris's body was covered in wounds. The lights in the room reflected on the blood that began to spread across the floor, staining the light wooden floor. The sound of the knife piercing Chris's body seemed endless. Jessica's desperate screams and Maria's terrified silence formed a horrible scene. When it finally stopped, Brian was covered in blood. His hands were shaking, and he was panting, his wild eyes still fixed on Chris' still body. Chris was dead. The room was dead silent, except for Jessica's choked sobs in the corner of the room. Maria, still not moving, watched the scene with empty eyes. She knew they had crossed a line from which there was no return. Brian, for his part, seemed to be in shock. He dropped the knife, which fell with a metallic clang to the bloody floor. His mind was blank, unable to fully comprehend what he had just done. He looked at Maria, as if expecting some form of comfort or direction. But Maria just shook her head slowly, tears beginning to well up in her eyes. They both knew that their lives had changed forever in that moment. They had committed the unthinkable, and now, all that was left was to flee. There was no turning back. There was no undoing what had been done. "We need to go," Maria finally whispered, her voice weak and shaky. Brian nodded silently, unable to speak. Without exchanging another word, they quickly began to gather their things. There was no time to think about what would happen next. There was only time to run. Leaving Jessica alone, in shock next to Chris's lifeless body, Brian and Maria hurriedly left the house. The night outside was dark, and the rain was falling heavily, erasing any traces they might have left. The sound of tires on gravel was muffled by the rain as the car disappeared down the road, leaving behind a scene that no one in that city would soon forget. And so, Brian and Maria disappeared into the night, fugitives from a crime scene of their own creation. While the police still didn't know what had happened in that country house, Chris's blood was mixing with the rainwater, and the search for justice was about to begin. It was a cold and rainy morning on October 22nd, 2018, in a quiet town in the interior of Texas. The storm that had formed in the sky seemed to be in keeping with the chaos that had occurred hours before in that isolated country house. Chris Harper, a 35-year-old businessman, now lay dead on his living room floor, the victim of a brutal series of stab wounds. His body was covered in blood, and the gloomy silence of the night was only interrupted by the constant dripping of rain on the roof. Inside the house, Jessica, still dazed, crawled to the phone to call 911. His hands were shaking so much he could barely dial the numbers. When he finally did, his voice was a desperate whisper, barely audible to the operator on the other end of the line. My husband. He is dead. Please help. There is so much blood. He is dead." The call was quick, and authorities were soon on their way. What awaited them in that house was not just a crime scene, but a dark mystery that would unfold in the following days. When the police arrived, they were greeted by a terrifying sight. Chris' body was stretched out in the middle of the room, surrounded by a pool of blood, and Jessica, in shock, could barely speak. She was covered in blood, not because she was to blame, but because she had tried in vain to save her husband in his final moments. The forensic team was quickly called to the scene. They began documenting the crime scene. The stabbings, the disorder throughout the house, the blood smeared across the floor and walls. It was a brutal scene, indicating an explosion of unusual anger and violence, something personal and full of resentment. While experts collected evidence, Jessica was taken to the police station to be questioned. She was still visibly shaken, her eyes lost and fixed on something that wasn't present in the room. Detectives knew she was the key to understanding what happened that night. However, they also knew that the trauma she had suffered would make it difficult for her to provide clear answers. "Jessica, we need you to tell us what happened. Every detail is important," Detective Collins said, trying to calm her down as he adjusted the recording of the statement. He knew the situation was delicate, but time was running out, and the killers were still out there. Jessica took a deep breath, trying to organize her thoughts amid the emotional turmoil she found herself in. She began to speak slowly, each word heavy with the weight of what she had witnessed. "We were all together. Brian, Maria, Chris, and I. It was supposed to be a normal night, a dinner with friends, but something went wrong. Chris, he discovered the messages between Brian and Maria, and then everything exploded. They fought. Chris went after Brian, and Brian. Jessica paused, fighting back tears. Brian took the knife. He didn't stop. I tried, but I couldn't." Maria just stood there, watching, doing nothing. The detectives exchanged glances, processing the information. Now, everything made more sense. The story Jessica told confirmed her suspicions. The crime was not a simple attack, but the result of an explosive betrayal. What was supposed to be a night of socializing between friends had turned into a bloodbath, provoked by the anger and despair of a betrayed man and a couple of lovers trying to hide their secret. As Jessica finished her report, the detectives already knew what they needed to do. Brian and Maria were the main suspects, and now they were on the run. The crime scene, the messages exchanged, Jessica's story, everything pointed to them. It was a matter of time before they were located. Meanwhile, the forensic team continued to examine the house. The knife used in the crime, still stained with blood, had been found on the floor next to Chris's body. The object, a simple kitchen knife, was now the centerpiece of the case. The marks on Chris' body indicated that he had been attacked in blind fury, 21 stab wounds, all concentrated on his torso and chest. There was no doubt that the attack was personal and intentional. Brian wanted to make sure Chris had no chance of survival. Around the house, police officers were looking for clues about Brian and Maria's escape route. Their car was gone, and with the storm covering their tracks, it would be difficult to track them. Local authorities soon issued a search alert for the entire region, notifying neighboring cities and increasing surveillance on roads and airports. They knew that if the loving couple managed to cross the border or change their identities, it would be much more difficult to find them. But Brian and Maria were not experienced criminals. They had made an unthinkable mistake in trying to cover up their affair, and now they were running not only from the law, but also from the consequences of their actions. Every kilometer they traveled towards the unknown only increased the feeling of guilt and fear. They knew that at any moment they could be captured, but panic and adrenaline drove them to continue. At the police station, while the detectives hatched a plan to capture the fugitives, Jessica sat alone, still processing everything that had happened. She couldn't believe that the friendship she and Chris had cultivated for so many years with Brian and Maria would end in this tragic way. The images of that horrible night were still burned into her mind, like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The clock continued to tick, and the search for Brian and Maria gained intensity. Authorities were determined to capture them before they disappeared forever. The crime that had started as a case of betrayal and jealousy now turned into a manhunt, where every minute counted. The quiet Texas town would never be the same, marred by the tragedy of that fateful night. News of Chris Harper's brutal murder spread quickly through the small Texas town of Garland, and within hours it was dominating local and national news. Brian and Maria, now fugitives, were on the run, leaving a trail of chaos wherever they went. Police were on high alert, and local authorities worked tirelessly to track down the cheating couple. The hunt had begun, and there was nowhere they could run without the weight of their actions catching up to them. It was now 3 a.m., and sirens were echoing throughout the city. Authorities knew time was critical. The longer it took to capture the two, the greater the chance that they would disappear forever. The main road connecting Garland to other small Texas towns was lined with police roadblocks, and helicopters equipped with thermal cameras scoured the area for signs of life. Brian and Maria were being hunted like animals. Meanwhile, inside a cheap roadside motel about 50 miles from the crime scene, the couple found themselves trapped, emotionally drained and utterly terrified. They had made the mistake of their lives. Brian, the once charismatic and successful businessman, now had a blank look and his hands were still stained with his best friend's blood. Maria, who had believed that escape was the only way out, was falling apart mentally, unable to process what they had done. "We shouldn't have done that, Brian," said Maria, shaking with fear. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and her voice could barely hide the growing panic that gripped her. "There's no point in going back now," Brian replied coldly, although his tone revealed the desperation he was trying to hide. "We have to continue. If we stop, they'll catch us." But they both knew they were trapped. With each passing minute, the feeling that the siege was closing grew stronger. They had abandoned the car a few miles from the motel, trying to lose the police, but they didn't know how long they would be able to hide. Back at the station, Detective Collins was receiving real-time updates. Maria's cell phone, last tracked in a rural area west of the city, provided a crucial clue to the couple's possible location. Tactical teams were immediately sent to the area as the pressure on Collins and his team increased. There was a sense of urgency in the air, as if everyone knew they were about to catch the two fugitives. As officers mounted the operation, Collins paused to reflect on the case. He knew that in situations like this, criminals, especially inexperienced ones, made fatal mistakes. He also knew that fear was a powerful ally in the hunt for fugitives. Brian and Maria were isolated, scared, and desperate, and this made their capture inevitable. Around 5 a.m., authorities finally located the motel where Brian and Maria were hiding. The place was small, with just a dozen rooms, and the team of police moved quickly to block all the exits. There was no way to escape. The tension in the air was palpable as the officers prepared to storm the room. They knew they were dealing with desperate people, and the possibility of a violent confrontation was real. Collins, however, was hopeful that Brian and Maria would surrender peacefully. After all, the weight of what they had done must already be starting to crush them inside. Inside the room, Brian heard the sound of sirens approaching. He knew it was the end. He looked at Maria, who was sitting on the bed, in shock. Their eyes met for a moment, and neither of them needed to say anything. They both knew there was nowhere left to run. "It's all over, Maria," Brian said, his voice full of resignation. He felt a sense of emptiness, as if all the adrenaline and anger that had driven him for the past few hours had finally disappeared. Maria just nodded, unable to respond. Her dreams of escaping with Brian to start a new life now seemed like a cruel joke. All she could think about was the image of Chris dead on the floor of the house, the blood she couldn't get off her hands no matter how many times she washed them. Outside, Detective Collins approached cautiously, speaking through a bullhorn. "Brian, Maria, we know you're in there," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "It's surrounded. Come out with your hands up, and no one will get hurt." He finished. There was a moment of dead silence. Then, the bedroom door slowly opened, and Brian and Maria walked out with their hands raised. Both of their faces were haggard, and the look they shared was one of pure defeat. They were quickly handcuffed and taken away by the police, without resistance. As they were led out of the motel, the two knew that the life they had known up until that point was destroyed. Brian, the successful businessman, and Maria, the wife who had once dreamed of a different life, were now convicted criminals. The forbidden love that had brought them together had not survived the tragedy they caused, and now they were trapped in the destiny they created for themselves. The hunt was over, but the scars they left on the town of Garland, the Harper and Wilson families, and themselves would never be erased. The blood spilled on that cold October night would forever mark their lives, a grim reminder of how a betrayal, a secret, and an impulsive decision can destroy everything they touch. Detective Collins watched as the couple were led away, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. He had closed the case, but the human tragedy he had witnessed that week would stay with him forever.